Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. This is National Nurses Month here in the States. Also, we are within National Nurses Week. And so this is a good time for us to pay tribute to those who serve and on the front lines. And so before I introduce our guest today, I will do a brief presentation for you about the nurses of Wheeling. So just give me a second here. Okay, if you'd like to read more about the nurses of Wheeling, you can go to archivingwheeling.org and you'll see the full story there. Our first nurse is Sister Ignatius Farley, who was one of the first Sisters of St. Joseph at Wheeling Hospital in 1863. And she, along with the other nuns who worked at the hospital, were recruited by the U.S. Army after the Army took over the hospital and made it a military hospital during the American Civil War. They treated both Confederate and Union soldiers who were wounded there. And she received a bronze medal for her efforts. And you can see her name at the Nuns of the Battlefield Monument in Washington, D.C. Also, a Civil War nurse was this woman, Mrs. Lydia Wilson Mother Holliday, and she actually served on the battlefields at Winchester, among others, at the age of 60 years, and was known as an angel of mercy of the battlefield. And the soldiers loved her so much, they insisted upon being her pallbearers when she died at the advanced age of 97, when she was said to be the oldest person in Wheeling. This is one of our featured nurses from Wheeling Hospital. This is Cecilia Coyne. She was a nurse educator and helped bring the first intensive care unit and cardiac intensive care unit, not just to Wheeling, but to the state of West Virginia. She developed a program to help young children who were to be hospitalized to overcome their fears by learning about the hospital before they came. And you can see her many of her artifacts on display now here at the library in our exhibit dedicated to nurses. This is my friend Ann Thomas. She was the first African-American nurse in Wheeling, and she worked at Lincoln School in Clay for decades as a nurse and overcame a lot of barriers to be a pioneer and lead the way for other Black nurses to enter the profession. This is Eleanor DeProsperous, another great nurse who graduated in 1962 from the Wheeling Hospital School of Nursing and went on to a long career, 47 years at the hospital. She was a head nurse in several departments, including med-surg and ICU, and started her career working with Cecilia Coyne on the intensive care unit, and traveled to Haiti to help train nurses, southern West Virginia, where people were uninsured. Went to China, was selected to be among a delegation of nurses from the United States to China. So many honors in her career, and some of her artifacts are also on display in our exhibit. This is someone who's special to me. Her name is Mary Ann Duffy, happens to be my mother, also graduated in 1962, and went to work the following Monday on the labor and delivery floor and remained a staff nurse there for over 40 years. And she often says that she is glad that she had a career on the happiest floor in the hospital, generally speaking, tears of joy. And I still, when I'm with her today and we're out somewhere, people will recognize her as the nurse who helped deliver their babies. So, and I want to end with this woman. This is Alice M. Young, who was a 1901 graduate of the City Hospital, which became OVGH, and joined the Red Cross. She moved here to Wheeling. She's from Ohio originally, and became an Army nurse during the First World War. I think it's appropriate to end with her because that will be one of our primary topics today. Ms. Young was sent to Camp Sevier in South Carolina where the camps were being ravaged by the first pandemic, the H1N1, known as the Spanish flu. She battled it for about a week, developed pneumonia, and died. And she is the only woman from Ohio County recognized as a World War I casualty. You can find her name on the Veterans Memorial in Charleston. Like I mentioned, we have an exhibit of Nurses of Wheeling right now on display at the library. Come down and check it out. And if you go to welunk.com, you can help us identify some nurses, mostly from OVGH, but also from Wheeling Hospital, who are in some of the photographs in our archives unidentified. So head on over to Wheelunk to check that out. And now I will introduce our guest. Dr. Christine Hallett is a registered nurse and the director of the Center for the History of Nursing and Midwifery at the University of Manchester, UK. She also holds fellowships with the Royal Society of Medicine and the Royal Society for the Arts. She is the author of the book, Celebrating Nurses of Visual History, which is how I found her. And we are very honored to have her here today, all the way from the UK. Here she is. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
And I now give you Dr. Hallett.
Thank you very much, Sean. Just to let you know, I've moved on from the University of Manchester. I'm now at the University of Huddersfield in the Department of History. Today I want to talk to you about not just about the book Celebrating Nurses, which was published in 2010, but about some work I did after that, which was looking at the nurses of the First World War. I did quite a lot of work, a number of projects, looking at First World War nursing after I'd published Celebrating Nurses. And I'm just going to start sharing my slides. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, it's going to take me a little bit longer because the file isn't immediately opening, so do bear with me. Yeah, sorry about this, Sean. When we practiced this, it gave me the option to open the slides, but I've only got all I've got now is the screen itself. Do you have the slides? We could do the famous next slide, please, option.
Yeah, we have that option. Let me run that for you.
Sorry about that. I probably would have to come out of this and open the slides again and go back in, so it might be easier if you shared.
We're used to this. It happens all the time. We adapt, we overcome. Here we go.
Okay, great.
I'm now going to go away and I'll run your show. Just let me know when you want to move on.
That's great. Thanks very much. That's brilliant. It's a bit like one less thing for me to think about. You do that job for me. Thank you. So yes, after I'd published Celebrating Nurses, I went on to do some work leading to a book that was published by Oxford University Press called Veiled Warriors. But we'll go straight into the first picture slide because I'm not specifically going to talk about that book. It's just that was my next book. And then I did further work on the nurses of the First World War. And I'd just like to show you some of the images of nurses from mostly British and US nurses and British and US First World War hospitals. But the book itself kind of covers Allied nurses of all nations, including French, Belgian and Russian nurses, also Australian and New Zealand and Canadian. So it's very wide ranging. But this paper today, this lecture, will consider some of the issues surrounding the image of the First World War nurse. And it will also in effect, it will compare myths and realities It'll look at the image of the First World War nurse, but also the reality of the work that nurse was doing. So this is, we're starting here with an image of a British nurse, Volta Billing, who was Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service sister. The First World War nurse is an icon, but like most iconic figures, her identity is obscured and distorted by the myths and narratives of successive generations. Three of the most pervasive myths of First World War nursing are the myth of the courageous mistreated volunteer, the myth of the romantic nurse who falls in love with her patient or with the doctor, and the myth of the nurse heroine who risks everything, not only to save individual patients' lives, but also to win the war. The legendary status of writers such as Vera Brittain have drawn a distorting curtain across the lives and experiences of tens of thousands of nurses, many of them highly trained professionals, whose experiences of the First World War were influenced by their position as female participants in a predominantly male world. So if all myths distort reality in order to present a deeper truth, then it's worth examining more closely those ideal forms over which nurses seemed to have little control. The courageous bullied volunteer, the romantic nurse, and the nurse as heroine. This last form was the only one to which nurses themselves aspired, even though they realised that it too distorted the reality of their professional contribution to the First World War by drawing attention away from their practice and towards their so-called heroic deeds. It's also worth exploring the myths nurses created, whether unconsciously or consciously, of themselves as fighters or battlers, as well as humanitarians. These veiled warriors believed they were fighting on three fronts: the second battlefield of the military hospital ward, where patients were pulled back from the brink of death; the dangerous territory of the war zone, in which all life was in danger; and the gendered and professional battlefield to which they would return, transformed by their experiences after the war. Behind the myths of courageous volunteers, romantic nurses, and heroic frontline carers, and largely obscured by these myths, lie the realities faced by a nascent profession, which was fighting its own hidden battles. Early 20th century nurses, the vast majority of whom were women, were engaged in two struggles: for the vote and for a professional nurses register that would recognise the training and experience of qualified nurses. In August 1914 in Britain, the campaign for nurse registration was well into its 27th year, and although parliamentary commissions in 1904 and 1905 had indicated their clear support, the securing of the much desired nurses professional register seemed as far away as ever. Actually, in the United States of America, some of the US states gained professional registration before Britain, but it was actually New Zealand. It was New Zealand nurses who first gained a professional register, and that was before the First World War. When the British government declared war, campaigners for both women's suffrage and nurse registration suspended their activities in order to put their energies into supporting the war effort. For most, their patriotism superseded their loyalties to gender and profession. Could I have the next slide, please, Sean? So that's very strange because I'm seeing a blank screen there. Are you? These slides really don't want to behave. Yeah, let's stick with that one. That's the next slide, after the one that would have been an image of a base hospital in France. This is actually an image of British Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service Reserve sister, member of the Nursing Reserve, Sister Kate Luard, so a British nurse for you here, wearing the typical uniform of the British QA, Queen Alexandra's nurses. At the outbreak of war, the nursing professions of most countries had still not succeeded in closing their professional ranks. Hence, the Allied military nursing services were a curious amalgam of highly trained elite professionals, semi-trained volunteers, and confident but largely untrained lady nurses. In the British Dominions and the United States of America, trained nurses dominated the services. The nascent army nursing services of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa were very small at the outbreak of war, but were able, before their deployment in late 1914, to expand their ranks through the recruitment of fully trained nurses. In the USA, the Army Nurse Corps, a small but effective cadre of highly trained and experienced nurses, had been created in 1901 following the Spanish-American War. Because American nurses didn't enter the war at its outset in 1914, and because of their distance from the conflict, these elite cadres of trained military nurses were able to close ranks and exclude anyone who did not comply with their strict criteria for a full professional training. So, along with Australian and New Zealand nurses, US nurses were the nursing corps consisted almost entirely of fully trained professional nurses rather than a combination of professional nurses and volunteer nurses. Those who nursed the wounded of the First World War were nevertheless a complex and heterogeneous group. In each of the Allied nations, there were those who regarded themselves as true nurses, individuals who'd undergone a carefully planned 2 or 3 year program of training, and who believed they possessed not only the knowledge, but also the experience to nurse well, safely. And then there were large numbers, certainly in Britain, of volunteer nurses, many of whom, particularly in parts of Europe, not just Britain, but France and Belgium as well, also on the Eastern Front in Russia, many of these volunteer nurses came from higher social classes than their professional counterparts. Every nation had far more volunteers than trained nurses, but proportions differed markedly, with Britain and its dominions having a greater proportion of professionals than most other Allied nurses, and France, Belgium, and Russia having a heavy reliance on experienced but minimally trained religious nurses, so nuns who nursed, and lady volunteers, who did tend to be from higher social class, as the term lady volunteer implies. And further complicating these military nursing services were male medical orderlies. In the USA, they were known as corpsmen, in Britain as orderlies, and in Russia as sanitars. Some British and American trained nurses found themselves working alongside both religious nurses and lady volunteers in French or Belgian-run field hospitals. Others became part of highly competent volunteer units, such as the Scottish Women's Hospitals, or resource-rich privately funded field hospitals, such as Millicent Duchess of Sutherland's Ambulance, and Hector Munro's Flying Ambulance Corps. And the idea that, Millicent Duchess of Sutherland was one of the better known heads of a volunteer hospital gives you a clue as to, where a lot of the funding was coming from for these volunteer units that really got to the continent at the outbreak of war before the official services. Large numbers of fully trained nurses, though, offered their services to the beleaguered Belgian nation at the outset of war, only to find themselves trapped inside bombarded towns or made prisoners of war by the advancing German army. Members of the Queen Alexandra's, it was the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, but I'll stick with Queen Alexandra's or QAs from now on. So members of the QA and its reserve were mobilized for service overseas from the earliest months of the war. In the period of rapid mobile warfare, prior to the formation of the trench system on the Western Front, they found themselves coping with chaos, caring for very large numbers of wounded men in squalid conditions with inadequate equipment. Sister Kate Luard, pictured here, was posted to a railway station in France, where she and colleagues waited for each passing train to stop. The doors of the large railway carriages would be opened, and they would board the train to offer what care they could to wounded men inside. By the time the wounded reached the care of nurses such as Luard, many were in terrible conditions, and this was in the early months of after the 4th of August 1914. Men with extensive injuries were lying on straw in their muddy, torn uniforms, with their wounds covered only by first field dressings. The trains were travelling slowly, conditions were cold, and food and water were scarce. All the nurses could do was clean their patients' contaminated wounds, apply clean dressings, and offer what food and water were available before the train moved on again to base. But that was only in the early months of the war. By about October 1914, the chain of evacuation, as it was called, on the Western Front became highly effective, or at least it became much more effective, and then developed gradually throughout the rest of the war. So Sean, we could see whether the next slide is there. Yeah, that's great. This is an image of the location that all of the wounded men in the chain of evacuation were hoping to reach. This is an image of an auxiliary hospital back in what they called Blighty, back in Britain. So by the end of 1914, a network of casualty clearing stations, hospital trains and barges, base hospitals, hospital ships and convalescent hospitals had developed, a process made easier by the fact that warfare had become static and entrenched on the Western Front. An initial process of apparent trial and error gave way slowly to a coordinated system of evacuation. Earlier wars, notably the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5, had provided models, but the system which was developed on the Western Front during the First World War was in many ways unique. One of its most significant features was the establishment of casualty clearing stations, CCSs, within 10 kilometres of the front lines. By October, it was being recognised that many of the deaths which had taken place in the first weeks of the war on the Western Front had been avoidable. The bullet and shell wounds sustained on the muddy, manured fields of Flanders and northern France were almost always heavily contaminated with anaerobic bacteria, which caused severe, life-threatening infections such as gas gangrene and tetanus. These wounds needed to be treated, whether by surgical removal of contaminated tissue or by treatment with antiseptics, as quickly as possible. The delay caused by transportation to base was costing lives, and there was a need for more small field hospitals capable of performing emergency surgery near the front. It was imperative to perform the surgery as close as possible to the front lines before these galloping infections could take hold. So next slide, please. This is an image of one of the US casualty clearing stations, an American casualty clearing station on the Western Front. So this is a photograph that was taken later in the war, after 1917, and it's this photograph is actually held by the University of Virginia, and it is an image of nurses belonging to the University of Virginia Base Hospital, who served within their own base hospital on the chain of evacuation in northern France, a good 40, 50 or 60 miles behind the line, those base hospitals. But individual nurses and small teams of nurses from those base hospitals travelled up the line to serve in casualty clearing stations very close to the front lines, well within 10 kilometres of the front lines. And this is an image of a hutted ward in one of those casualty clearing stations, with a nurse from the University of Virginia Base Hospital in the foreground there, appears to be taking a patient's wound. So if we go back to 1914, though, and think about the establishment of these casualty clearing stations very close to the front lines. At that time, male military medical officers had serious doubts over the wisdom of posting women so close to the front lines, believing that they would be unable to cope with the privations and stresses of life in the zone of the armies. If we just move on to the next slide, we'll come back to University of Virginia nurses in a moment, but I just want to show you this image of Maud McCarthy. She was matron-in-chief for the British Expeditionary Forces in France and Flanders. And this image does actually appear in my book, Celebrating Nurses, which Sean is kind of kindly promoting today, I guess we could say. This is one of the images that appears in the First World War section of that book. She was a remarkable and indomitable nurse leader on the Western Front, and she embraced the idea of having nurses very close to the front lines in casualty clearing stations. And she was supported in this by her senior matron-in-chief for the Queen Alexandra's, Ethel Hope Beecher. Both women had served as military nurses with the nascent army nursing services during the Second Anglo-Boer War at the turn of the century. And even though wound infection in South Africa had presented nothing like the problems seen now in northern France, both of these senior nurses recognized the importance of rapid surgical intervention and the impossibility of providing such intervention without nursing expertise. There was, however, a problem. When these CCSs, casualty clearing stations, were first formed, small groups of nurses were drawn from base hospitals in Boulogne in northern France, at times when rushes of casualties were already putting those hospitals under pressure, so this left the base hospitals short of staff. So McCarthy urged the military medical services to allow for a sizable reserve of highly competent nurses at Boulogne and other bases, ready to be moved forward to CCSs at short notice. So nurses were employed in CCSs for the first time during the First Battle of Ypres in October 1914. And the development of this system would later permit recognised surgical teams, each consisting of a surgeon, an anaesthetist, a nursing sister, and orderlies, to move together as a unit from base to CCS, and also as need arose between CCSs. And it's quite interesting from the point of view of American nurses that if you think of a surgical team being a surgeon, an anaesthetist, a nursing sister, and an orderly, with many of the American units, because nurse anaesthetists were an innovation that was already underway in the USA in civilian practice, American surgical teams often consisted of 2 men and 2 women, rather than 3 men and a woman, as with the British and Dominion teams. In the US surgical teams, one of the nurses was also the anaesthetist. So you actually had 2 nurses, one of whom was practicing as an expert anaesthetist, fully trained and experienced anaesthetist. It was bringing these nurse anaesthetists to the Western Front that encouraged the British and Dominion services to begin to introduce nurse anaesthetists as well. But that didn't really happen until 1917. Going back again to 1914, one of the earliest nurses to serve in a CCS was Glaswegian Jenty Patterson. Clearly a highly educated professional woman, Patterson was confident in her skill and determined in her opinions. On the 7th of August, so very early in the war, she travelled to her training hospital, Guy's, in London, to enlist for service as a member of the Queen Alexandra's Reserve. In November 1914, she was given the opportunity to travel to join number 5 casualty clearing station at Hasbrook in northern France. In a letter home, she explained that she was, quote, one of the furthest up lot of sisters, except those on the trains. We see the flashes of the guns and hear the roar day and night. She commented that the colonel had not wanted nurses at the CCSs, believing that not only would they be unable to cope with the dirt and squalor of a field hospital, but they might actually be in danger. At that time, stories of German atrocities against Belgian civilians were being amplified by the British propaganda machine. And there was a lot of fear around what might happen to civilians in the so-called zone of the armies. But Patterson, along with other nurses, had volunteered for what she referred to as the most dirty work going. She wasn't allowed to proceed to a casualty clearing station until she'd made a written statement that she was accepting her post voluntarily. Her ward was the huge hall of a monastery. So casualty clearing stations used various accommodation, buildings that were already standing. Very often, they used tents with large marquee tents as the hospital wards, so under canvas. And then later on in the war, when aerial bombardment began in earnest in the rest areas behind the front, they shifted from tents to huts, to hutted wards, which would keep the shrapnel out. And I'll go back to that casualty clearing station hospital image in a moment. But Jenty Patterson talked about how at the approach of a convoy of patients, wounded men, the staff in the hospital would hear a whistle and then a fleet of motor ambulances would arrive. On some days, the CCS took in 300 wounded men at a time, and it would take a few hours to bring them all into the hospital and triage them, assess them all. And they had to be carefully triaged in order to decide which were in the most urgent need of operation. And it was often nurses who did that work of assessment because all the surgeons were busy in the operating theatres. So if you just move on to the next slide, please, Sean. Thank you. So this is from Jenty Patterson, and this is actually transcribed from a very small pocket diary, which you get the impression she actually kept contemporaneously, that she was actually completing this diary every night or every few nights while she was actually practicing in this casualty clearing station. The terseness and brusqueness of the text kind of gives you that impression that she was squeezing it into a very small space, but into also a very small space of time in which to write. Apologies, maybe should have given you a trigger warning. There is some gory detail in some of the text and images in this slide. So she talks about some of the patients she was nursing. Lost one man today. Poor chap, leg black, operation, died on the table. Another, as if to cheer us up, who seemed more desperate, had mortified up to the level of right kidney. He has 17 incisions in his abdominal walls and is going to pull through. And that is another reason we're up here. Such cases could not live without operation at once, and they require careful nursing afterwards. Of course, we have no beds, only stretchers, no air cushions, no sheets. So you use all your skill and ingenuity. I had a man last week who was almost pulseless for hours. Today he's eating tinned chicken and travels to the base tomorrow with a healthy stump. It's marvellous what can be accomplished amidst the din and dirt and dust of a convoy, and a good hot meal and sleep goes a long way. Nursing on stretchers on the floor is of course killing work and takes much more time. We literally nurse and improvise at the same time. And that diary is actually located in the Imperial War Museum archives in London. So if we have the next slide, just to go back to that casualty clearing station image again, thank you. The avoidance and treatment of wound infection had become a subject of great controversy by the spring of 1915. Initially, when confronted with the combat wounds of the First World War, surgeons had implemented a conservative treatment which had proved successful during the Second Anglo-Boer War, consisting of a sterile dressing which was put onto the wound and left undisturbed for several days. But this didn't work in the First World War. It soon became clear that wounds contracted on the muddy fields of France and Flanders were very different from those associated with the dry, dusty South African veldt. Some surgeons, such as William Watson Chain and Sir Anthony Bowlby, began to advocate the rigorous and unsparing use of antiseptics to combat these virulent infections. Sir Almroth Wright argued vociferously for the use of a hypertonic saline solution, which would draw serum through the wound, mobilizing the body's own defenses against disease. Probably the most successful treatment was that recommended by H.M.W. Gray, the excision, the removal of large areas of tissue around the wound to get rid of all infected matter. Nurses, as the practitioners most likely to dress patients' wounds, found themselves at the centre of controversy and having to exercise considerable diplomacy in following doctors' orders, whilst ensuring that their patients had the best chance of survival. A British nurse, Violetta Thurston, who again is referred to in the book Celebrating Nurses, she wrote one of the clearest and most succinct textbooks of the First World War. And she advised nurses, quote, to never give the impression that they disagree with the surgeon for whom they're working. The soldier is one of the quickest people in the world to discover any want of harmony, and certainly the feeling that the best possible is not being done for him would react on his mental condition, retard his recovery, and make him anxious and suspicious. So I don't think it was the case that nurses often disagreed with doctors, but I do think it was the case that they often had views and opinions on their own. We're in the midst of this controversy about what were the best treatments and all the trial and error that was going on. I think they did have opinions of their own, and this was an era where nurses were expected to obey doctors' orders with an intelligent obedience, but that word obedience was used in the nursing textbooks. It's not something you would see now, as nurses are much more autonomous in their practice. That they were in a tricky diplomatic position during the First World War, implementing treatments devised by surgeons and often very much a subject of experimentation and trial and error. If you could move on to the next slide, it should be an image of, yes, a territorial hospital in the UK. This one is in the city of Manchester. So wounds were not the only types of damage suffered by those who fought in the First World War. Even on the Eastern Front, soldiers lived in trenches for many weeks at a time, enduring the dirt and filth of their subterranean surroundings. They existed among lice, fleas, rats, and even on occasions the partially buried corpses of their fellow men. And many soldiers became dangerously ill with diseases such as dysentery and typhus, simply as a result of being forced to live in such squalid conditions. CCSs and base hospitals could become particularly busy at times of cold and wet weather, when already muddy trenches became waterlogged with icy or slushy water. Soldiers were obliged to wade through whatever mud or water lay at the bottom of their trenches. Some recounted tales of trenches which were waist deep in mud. This, combined with the interruption of the blood supply by tight puttees, could lead to a condition known as trench foot, which was believed to be a fungal infection existing concurrently with frostbite and made worse by poor circulation. Trench foot could be highly dangerous. It often resulted in the loss of toes and sometimes led to more serious infections such as gangrene. For some sufferers, the only solution was the amputation of the foot, and many soldiers lost both feet to this disease. When nurses received these patients in CCSs, once they treated wounds and offered shock treatment and pain relief, they worked to remove layers of mud from patients' bodies and to offer the warmth and rest that would assist a return of circulation. The dangers of trench life and the intense stress of battle also led to severe mental illnesses, which were collectively labelled shell shock. Douglas Bell, a member of the British Expeditionary Force who was injured 3 times, wrote of how, in Flanders, during April, he had, quote, a bad time with shells and trench mortars. He described how terrific the concussion of the shell could be, and how it could sometimes demolish whole stretches of trench. And he wrote in his memoir, quote, "You hear the faint thud of the discharge, look up, see it coming, whirling and twisting in the air, and scuttle along the trench away from it. But this gets on your nerves after a while. It's so tiring dodging up and down the trench like that." In addition to exhaustion, he and his fellow sufferers were becoming, as he said it, as he quoted it, engulfed in slime every time they ducked because their trench was a moving river of mud. The contrast between Bell's descriptions of trench life and his experiences of hospital care are striking and offer a poignant illustration of the comfort that could be offered in a base hospital. After being wounded in the leg and having what he said was a slight chill and catarrh following a whiff of gas just outside Ypres, he was conveyed by ambulance to a casualty clearing station at Poperinghe, feeling rather shivery and empty, as he put it. By the time he'd been transferred by hospital train to Boulogne, where, as he called her, some dear sister was in charge, and then by steamer and another train to Guy's Hospital in London, he felt that, quote, life was luxurious, everybody most kind. Bell was even more seriously wounded later that year in October, and this time he was taken to the Duchess of Westminster's Hospital at Le Touquet, a spacious, beautiful place, where he, quote, received the greatest kindness from everyone, from the Duchess herself to the ward orderly. Douglas Bell was one of the many who endured hardship and terror without succumbing to shell shock, yet his experiences place into context the suffering of those who became seriously mentally ill. They also illustrate the sense of well-being which could be experienced by a patient in a military hospital. So if you think of them traveling, from those horrific conditions in the trenches down the line through via a motor ambulance to a casualty clearing station, and then being loaded onto a train to a base hospital in northern France, from there onto a hospital ship, then another train to a territorial hospital like this one in this image. They're moving from the chaos of the trenches to the extreme neatness of this carefully posed photograph. A lot of these First World War photographs were very carefully positioned and posed. It always strikes me when I look at this image of how tightly the bedclothes have been tucked in here at the bottom of the bed. You've got a kind of a movement from chaos to order and safety here. Just moving on, there's an image of a nurse there, nurse with equipment on a trolley. Nurses themselves could suffer from shell shock. In 1915, a young middle-class British volunteer, Alice Essington Nelson, secured a position as assistant to Lady Gifford, head of house at Princess Louise's convalescent home for nursing sisters. Enthused by her new responsibilities, Essington Nelson spent much time with the sick sisters, as they were called, listening to their stories, many of which were truly remarkable. Some described how in the earliest days of the war, they'd slept on the floors of their billets and spent their days cleaning the hotel rooms that were to become their hospital wards. Others told of nursing on the earliest hospital trains, with no furniture or bunks of any kind. After the establishment of base hospitals and evacuation lines on the Western Front, many found themselves overwhelmed with rushes, as they called them, rushes of patients. For Essington Nelson, the nurse who wrote about this, their devotion to their patients was magnificent. Some nurses contracted serious, life-threatening illnesses as a result of nursing patients with infectious diseases. Clementina Addison, a British nurse who trained at the Leicester Royal Infirmary, had joined the French Flag Nursing Corps and nursed in various French field hospitals, but died of typhus in the spring, typhus fever, probably contracted in one of those hospitals in the spring of 1915. and she's buried she was brought home actually very ill and died after reaching home, and is buried in the churchyard in her home village of Caton in Lancashire in the UK. And her name is engraved on the war memorial for that village, alongside her soldier comrades, with the words, "By their sacrifice, we live." A number of nurses, I mentioned earlier that nurses got caught up in Belgium and taken prisoner as a result of the rapid German advance. The same thing happened to a number of nurses in Serbia during the winter of 1915, during the very rapid German-Bulgarian advance. And a lot of nurses and a number of volunteer units in Serbia had to join the retreat, a great retreat of the Serbian army. It was referred to as a great retreat across the Albanian Alps, extremely difficult terrain, and a journey that took well over a week to reach the Adriatic coast. And this journey was taken over high alpine mountains in the winter months. And if we can look at the next slide, this should be the text, a piece of text from the Nursing Times, where the nursing profession is kind of lauding and celebrating the bravery and stoicism of its nurses. We're thankful to hear of the safe arrival in this country of some of our heroic nurses from Serbia, and glad to know that about 75 of them, including 22 members of the Scottish Women's Hospital and 33 of Mrs. Stobart's party, arrived in time to spend Christmas at home. The party walked 200 miles through Serbia, Montenegro, and Albania, a daily 16-mile tramp under the most awful conditions possible, through knee-deep snow, over high mountains. If we move on again, and I'll move on a little bit more rapidly, moving back to Sister Kate Luard here. She wanted to talk a little bit about the great campaigns of the large campaigns of 1916 and 1917. By mid-1916, the Allied medical services on the Western Front were treating more casualties in France than ever before. And their experiences in 1915 had taught them to pair up casualty clearing stations to form larger units. And on the eve of the Battle of the Somme in the summer of 1916, this system of pairing casualty clearing stations was in place, and plans were being drawn up to bring into the area a sufficient number of ambulance trains to evacuate 10,000 wounded men per day. And if you think of, they were planning to evacuate 10,000 wounded men per day, but the casualty figures for just the first day of the Battle of the Somme were 60,000 casualties. 19,000 casualties. This was clearly an underestimate. So the nurses in those casualty clearing stations and the units as a whole were very much overwhelmed at first, but rapidly got that situation under control. Similarly, the Third Battle of Ypres, known as Passchendaele, has entered the psyche of Western nations. The suffering of troops has been immortalized by the writings of war poets. And even before the assault, casualty clearing stations and base hospitals were already under pressure because the cold, wet conditions, that campaign also began in the later summer, but the weather was unseasonably cold and wet. So the hospitals were already overwhelmed by trench foot and trench fever. And then during the push, came to be known as Passchendaele, it became difficult to collect the wounded from the battlefield. 6 or 8 men were sometimes needed to carry a single stretcher, and progress would be slow as they waded through several feet of mud. As a result, the incidence of those anaerobic wound infections began once more to rise, along with the need for the amputation of limbs. During that campaign, toxic gas poisoning also became a larger problem than before, as new forms of gas and new ways of delivering gas were devised. At this point, dichlorethyl sulfide, or mustard gas, was being used and was delivered into trenches using gas shells. So Kate Luard, pictured here, during that campaign was sister in charge of the number 32 Advanced Abdominal Centre, a huge specialist casualty clearing station. By this time, casualty clearing stations were not only pairing together, they were now being used in threes rather than just pairs. And there was specialism. I often wonder how they managed this amidst the pressures of these large campaigns like the Third Battle of Ypres. But they were able to sort the wounded and take them to specialist centres. So Kate Luard was in charge of an abdominal centre. There were also centres for head injuries, centres for shell shock, and fractured femur, fracture injuries. There were a range of different specialisms. I can see that I don't have a huge amount of time left. So let's just see what the next slide is, if we could, Sean. Yeah, this is actually the final slide. And this shows a part of the so-called Victory Parade of the summer of 1919, where the nurses, the soldiers, the armies, the military, the army, navy and air force marched through London. There were a number of victory parades in different cities throughout Europe. This is the London Victory Parade, and this photograph has captured the nurses part of that parade, where they're in their smartest uniforms, and the woman right at the front of the photograph there is Maud McCarthy, the matron-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force in France and Flanders. In 1918, well before this picture was taken, Maud McCarthy was writing in her diary of how stressful conditions were becoming. There was an acute and worsening shortage of nurses because workloads had increased dramatically, as had morbidity and mortality amongst staff. A lot of nurses were being sent to Sick Sisters, and of course the Spanish influenza pandemic, which began in the summer of 1918, was causing major problems from the late summer onwards. It has been described as one of the 3 most deadly episodes of disease in human history, the other 2 being the pandemics of bubonic plague in the 6th and 14th centuries. So the Spanish flu pandemic was huge. And it's been estimated that well over 20 million people died, no vaccines in those days. Many of the worst affected were frontline soldiers whose immune systems had already been compromised by trench life. And this naturally meant a massive increase of workloads for nurses who were already under pressure. And a lot of nurses wrote in their diaries and their letters of how sad it was, even as they were hearing celebrations of the armistice in November 1918, on November the 11th, 1918, outside the windows of hospitals in cities like London. As they would hear those celebrations, they were watching patients die of Spanish influenza with very sad parents sitting by the bedsides. A number of them described these sorts of scenes. So to conclude, this war, waged by nurses, both trained and volunteer, was a multi-layered one. Above all, the nurses saw themselves as fighting against pain, disease, and death. Theirs was what one of them referred to as the second battlefield, where the wounded were drawn back from the abyss of death. And by inhabiting that battlefield, nurses themselves faced hardship, injury, and sometimes death. Beyond this, nurses were fighting for recognition, for the right to exercise the freedoms and responsibilities that were due to them as both citizens and professionals. For some, this was a fight for women's rights, and above all, a fight for the vote. For others, it was a struggle for the recognition of their skills and talents as not merely innate elements of their femininity, but as qualities which had been hard won through years of training and discipline. The serene image of a nurse by the bedside of a wounded soldier belies the turbulence that infused this veiled warrior's everyday existence. And that's it. Thanks, Sean. You could stop screen sharing the slides. Thank you very much for showing those for me. Not sure what went wrong with my version of them, but thanks very much. That was great. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for an interesting presentation. Let's see if we have any questions. I do see one. I'll put it up on the screen here.
Were these war nurses adequately compensated for their heroic work? I don't think so. That's a really good question. So there were so many different types of nurse. Yeah, I guess there's a different answer for the different type of nurse. If you look at the fully trained professional nurses, and if we're thinking, no, we're in, you're all in, and I'm kind of somehow dipping into the USA today. Those were all fully trained professional nurses who joined base hospitals attached to particular universities and were paid a salary for their service in wartime. The British, Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian nurses were also paid their salary. They weren't paid a higher salary as a result of war service. They were paid by the military medical services, by the army, rather than by their hospital. But that pay was never, for any of the different nurses, significantly higher than that they would have received for civilian service. Members of regular Army nursing services like the US Army Nurse Corps and the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service in Britain did receive a specific Army nurse pay. But again, I think I'm right in saying it was slightly higher than civilian pay, and they did see themselves as an elite cadre of nurses, but they weren't given what we would call danger money, for working so close to the front lines or doing such difficult work that put their lives at risk, or working 16-hour shifts. They were never paid overtime. They were given a salary and an allowance to buy their uniforms. Volunteer nurses at first weren't given a salary at all, but from the spring of 1915 onwards, they were paid as well and given an allowance for their uniforms. But they weren't as dependent on their salaries, in that a lot of volunteer nurses had private means and had more money anyway. Some of them had private wealth to fall back on. In terms of being compensated after the war, quite a number of nurses were awarded medals. In Britain, nurses were awarded, some nurse leaders were awarded the Royal Red Cross. Nurses who were in danger and did work under fire or in very difficult conditions were sometimes awarded the military medal. So they were compensated in that way. But when it came to nurses who were wounded or made sick as a result of their war service, they did have to struggle through a very difficult process in order to get a war pension. They were treated often as veterans and they could apply for a pension. But if you were, for example, wounded by your war service and unable to work, it could actually be difficult to get a pension that could allow you to kind of keep body and soul together after the war if you were unable to work because of your injuries. So it's a difficult question to answer. Personally, I think they should have been rewarded. They should have been better rewarded.
Of course. And I have one question, and then we'll wrap it up for today. But I hear about World War I nursing quite a bit, and you hear about in the context of the American Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
How had nursing changed by the Second World War, if it had significantly? What changes were there? What lessons were learned? Let's say.
Yeah, one of the major changes that happened during the Second World War was that military nurses in countries other than Canada actually were given officer status. And that happened during the course of the Second World War, slightly different dates in different nations. I don't want to get that wrong, so I won't hazard a memory guess. But they attained officer status in the 1940s, so they were recognised more as being part of the military. not just kind of an adjunct to the military, but actually nursing corps within the military medical services and within the army itself. I mentioned Canadian nurses. They actually had military status during the First World War, and that was highly unusual. And all the other nurses in the other allied nations thought that was extraordinary. You know, that Canadian nurses were recognised as having officer status. In terms of the practices of the nurses, the practices changed considerably. You know, they were no longer having to pour antiseptics into huge open wounds, because they could now actually, from 1943 onwards, could use antibiotics. So the wound care was much less laborious, much less labor intensive once you got into the Second World War. And you also didn't have as great a problem from anaerobic wound infections, because again, you were looking at a short campaign in northern France and then quite a long desert campaign. But again, it's not so much associated with the kind of mud and manure and conditions of France and Flanders. So you don't have the same problems with anaerobic wound infections. Like, it's actually harder. I think the work and the conditions and their situation was much more challenging, I think, actually, for nurses in the First than in the Second World War. But that's not to undermine, you know, the huge sacrifices and the stamina that had to be shown by Second World War nurses as well.
Right. Christine, thank you. Here. I'm going to mute your mic, but I wanted to thank you for an excellent presentation. Before we go today, I will remind you that this summer we'll be doing the Bugs and People's University. That's one of our t-shirts. You can win these during the program. We'll start on May 27, Thursday evenings at 6:30 p.m. We also have tote bags. We have the author of this book talking about the cicadas, which inspired the program. And so next week, Cynthia Hilliard will be here on Livestream to talk about her novel, Rook Makes a Move. It's her first novel, and that'll be a change of pace. Thank you, Christine, again, and everyone who attended today. See you next time. Goodbye.